In this video, we're going to address one of the biggest pain points I have seen in FPV today, and that is the frustrating complexity of FRSKY's receiver firmware ecosystem. My FRSKY receiver won't bind to my FRSKY radio. And then we go down this long, complicated decision tree where I ask you which receiver you've got, which firmware is on it, is it this, is it that? If only there was a way to just freaking update the firmware on the receiver quickly and easily, then none of this would matter because we would just pick the right firmware, flash it, and then we'd just be done. Well, in case you haven't figured it out, that has happened. At least that is the promise of FRSKY's Archer series of receivers. These receivers ship with the newest, latest access-capable firmware on them, and they ship with the functionality of over-the-air firmware updates. In other words, if you've got the wrong firmware, which you shouldn't, because unlike the older receivers, which ship with who knows what firmware on them, the Archers always ship with the latest. If you've got the wrong firmware and you need to update it, you don't have to desolder anything, plug anything in. You just hit a freaking button on your radio, boop, and it updates it wirelessly over the air, like Crossfire has done forever. But this isn't a video about Crossfire. This is a video about the FRSKY Archer receivers. These could be the new go-to receiver if you are in the FRSKY ecosystem. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. The first thing we got to get out of the way going into this video is that these receivers all use access firmware. In other words, if you have one of the older radios that doesn't have the access capability, this isn't for you. If you bind in D16 mode or D8 mode, this isn't for you. You're going to need a radio like the newer, I've got the X9 Lite, the X Lite Pro, the QX7S, any of these newer access radios. And I think this is the first big compelling selling point for those radios, because for all of the things that access brought to the table, the fact that until now you couldn't buy a freaking receiver with access firmware on it kind of pulled the rug out from under the whole thing, because a lot of people are not going to buy the receiver and then download the firmware and then flash the firmware. Just want to buy it and bind it and go. So that's the promise. Let's do it. What I want to do in this video is first, I'm going to download the firmware. I'm going to update my radio, and then I'm going to try to flash firmware to the receiver and see how it works and demonstrate how it works. Even though technically that shouldn't be necessary, it should just be ready to go. But I want to demonstrate and test it out and just see how easy or not easy it turns out to be. So the first thing I'm going to suggest you do is take your SD card out of your radio and just put it into an SD card reader on your computer. You don't have to do that. The radio can read the SD card via the USB port, but it's a lot faster to transfer files directly to the SD card. And at least on the X Lite, it's so freaking easy to take the SD card out. It's right there on the bottom. Just pop it out and put it in the SD card reader on your computer. Now, if for whatever reason you don't want to do that, you can turn your radio on and we'll plug in USB to the radio, and the radio is going to ask whether we want USB joystick or USB storage. We'll select USB storage, and when we do that, we will get a removable drive pop up on our computer. One of these removable drives is the firmware for the radio. Don't touch that. Just close that window and don't mess with it. The other removable drive is your SD card contents. And what you're going to want to do is go into the firmware folder. We're going to download some stuff and put it there. The other thing I'm going to do is go to the product page for my Archer receiver. I have the Archer M+. Go to download and go to firmware and download the latest firmware there as well. And likewise, I'm going to put that in the firmware folder on my SD card. Okay, well, moment of truth. I've got the Archer M+ installed here in the quad, and the first thing, I'm not even going to bind it, because the first thing I want to know is, can you flash firmware to this receiver if it's just come and it's in kind of an unknown state, right? I've never even seen this receiver before, but I know I want to put this firmware on it. This is the single biggest pain point for people using FRSKY in my experience. Let's try it. So what I need to do is press the menu key, or long press the menu key, page to the SD card contents, scroll down to firmware, select the Archer firmware. This is the FRSK file. That's the firmware file for the receiver. Long press and Flash RX by int OTA. OTA is over the air update. I believe that is what we need to pick. Waiting for RX. Plug in. No dice. Do I need to push a button? Okay, so the LED status on the receiver has now changed to green and red, but still nothing happening. Maybe I need to hold down the bind button on the receiver. Let's try that. Still haven't solved that, have we, FRSKY? Okay, receiver is now in binding mode. It's got solid red and green. No dice. Okay, now this doesn't entirely surprise me, because if you could flash firmware to a random receiver without ever having bound it, that would be a kind of a risk. But then again, Crossfire and Ghost have solved this problem. You use the bind button to say, hey, I'm going to bind it, and updating the firmware is part of binding. Let's try to bind this first and then see if we can get it to do a firmware update. So I'm going to press menu key one time, page, scroll down. Internal RF mode is access. Module register. Waiting. So now I'm going to hold down the bind button and plug in. RX name M+, yes, we are registered. Registration okay. And then we need to bind receiver to bind. Waiting for RX. Hang on. Power cycle. Select RX M+. Done. Bind successful. By the way, notice this is one of the cool things about Access. I've already got a different RXSR bound to the same model. You can bind more than one receiver to the same model. That's kind of cool. Now that it's bound, can we do the firmware update?
Telemetry lost.
Firmware screen. Long press. Flash OTA. Waiting for RX. Plug in. Ah, now it works. Select RX M+. Let's update the firmware. Archer X, current version 2.10. Do you want to update? Very clever. So they're showing you, this is another frustrating thing, is not knowing what version is on it. It'll tell you, and I'm like, oh, I don't know, that's 2.15. I do need to update. Okay, let's update the firmware. Yay. Select RX. Yes. Enter. And it's updating. Yay. What happens if the update is interrupted? Crossfire has an emergency recovery mode where if it's interrupted, it stores a backup firmware on the receiver itself, and if the update is interrupted, you can force it to fail back. Let's see if that has worked. Transfer failed. Probably. Yeah, it's probably fine because the transfer failed. It wasn't loading in the middle. All right, so it's almost done. It's going to now go into a mode where it loads the firmware, I think. Usually it'll download the firmware and then flash. Oh no. Oh. What's it doing? The light is off. I'm going to pull the plug right now. Bound.
Telemetry recovered.
Okay. Well, I'm not really sure I understand how the firmware update process works, but I tried unplugging the quad in the middle of the upload, and I tried unplugging the quad immediately after the upload, which is when normally the receiver would be actually doing the flash, and I couldn't get it to fail. So it's got some kind of resiliency built in, and that's kind of nice. I would say if there's one thing I could ask for, it would be the ability to do the firmware update without having bound to the receiver. The way that Crossfire and Ghost handle this is you press the bind button, The next thing that happens is if a firmware update is needed, the firmware update can occur, and then the binding occurs. And that means that if you are on mismatched firmware versions that can't bind to it, like you've got an old receiver with an old firmware that can't bind to the new firmware on your radio, you can update that receiver without ever having to bind to it. In the FRSKY system, it appears like they won't let you do an over-the-air update unless you can bind first. But if you need to update in order to bind, you're kind of stuck. Well, you would have to either flash your radio back to a different firmware version, then bind and update, or you would need to plug your receiver in, which you're back in the realm of things being a huge pain in the ass. Nevertheless, it seems like the Archer line of receivers represents a big step forward for FRSKY. They come pre-shipped with the latest, greatest Access firmware, so you get all the performance and usability enhancements that Access has to offer. Finally, you have a freaking reason to buy an Access radio, because now you can actually buy a receiver that's compatible with it out of the box, and the over-the-air firmware updates means that in the future going forward, you won't be stuck having to solder stuff up and deal with all the nonsense that people have to deal with today with the other receivers in order to flash them. So then, which Archer receiver should be the one for you? Let's just take a quick look at the Archer line as it stands today and try and pick one. And there's a ton of them in here that are clearly designed more for airplanes and stuff with servo outputs. But I think the one that looks the most interesting is the Archer M Plus and the Archer RS. The M Plus is clearly similar to the XM Plus receiver. It's a non-diversity. Actually, the XM Plus is diversity. Ouch. It's more like the XM, I guess. It's non-diversity, full range, and it costs about 15 bucks. Pretty freaking good. And the Archer RS seems a lot like the RXSR. It is diversity. We've got a lot of, what are those signal? What are these pads? The RS costs 20 bucks. Yeah. Oh, it's got inverted smart port out, and it's got S-Bus in for redundancy. So that's pretty slick. Yeah, so I think my go-to on most of my quads, if I was going to buy one of these, would be the Archer RS. It seems like mostly a drop-in replacement for the RXSR, except it has inverted smart port output. So if you have an F4 processor and you don't have an inverted pad, you're trying to do smart port or F port, this is going to actually make that a whole lot easier. If you're working with an F7 processor, this doesn't really matter. Good for you, FRSKY. Major step in the right direction. I wish that there hadn't been so many what I would call missteps on the way for the last 2 freaking years. There was a time in the past when you just bought a receiver, you bound it, and you didn't think about firmware at all. And then for like the last 2 freaking years, there have been these EU versus FCC firmware. That was a thing if you were in the U. Okay, but for the most part. And then for the last like 2 years, there have been all these hassles with various incompatibilities and so forth. And now, hopefully, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We shall see. That's going to do it for this video. Thanks for watching. Happy flying. Do you see this baby? Isn't he cute? Hit the subscribe button. Join my Patreon. Use my affiliate links. Or just keep watching videos. That's better than nothing.
Google Gaga, subscribe to my daddy.